love to know. And yeah, just bear with us. We'll get started in a couple minutes. And Dan, did you want to share your screen, or do you want us to wait and do that later, or what was your decision about that?
Let me talk a bit, and then
Okay,
I'll
sounds
share
good.
some. I'll lay some story down, and then we'll get some pictures. All right?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Okay, we've got
Dan, can I?
Sylvia. Okay, go ahead, Christina.
I wanted to ask you an unrelated question.
Mhm.
But your sound treatment in that room, it's fantastic. Can you make a little bit about it?
Oh, this is a podcast room in the
Okay.
at the Washington Bureau at USA Today,
Oh, nice.
where I don't see it in use much. Um, now we've got a studio in New York, and now people just I think this was built at a slightly earlier technological time when stuff was happening on site. Now now they just email us a link, and then
Gotcha.
we pop in there. So yeah, there are mics here. There are like little recorders. There's
Yeah,
all
it
kinds of.
sounds fantastic.
Oh, good. I'm glad. I can never tell with these laptops what kind of sound you'll get.
That's funny. I didn't even notice, but Christina's husband is a sound designer, right, Christina?
Yeah, he's an audio engineer, and I was
Audio.
curious specifically about the absorbing things on the wall. Just he's gonna put those in his home studio soon, and they look very aesthetically pleasing. So getting some ideas of how to like arrange them. So
There's a right. There's a shadow here. That's maybe a
yeah,
little off, but I don't know. But
I like
sound
the way that they're arranged.
good.
Yeah.
Okay, so it looks like we're about 2 minutes after, so maybe let's get started. Christina, looks like someone just maybe signed up just a second ago. If you want to send them that link as well.
Yeah, I will do that, and then once I have,
And then deactivate it.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, great. So thanks everyone for coming. I see some familiar faces here today, and some people have said hello in the chat. We've got Sylvia from New York City. We have Betty from Florida with Love. We have Joan Eisenberg from New York City. Hi, Joan. Nice to see you. It's been a while. And Chris Tyree, who says, "What's up, Dan? Good to see you." I also see Eleanor Crook is in the audience, and Melissa Margolis, Michael Canisto. So a lot of old friends and familiar faces. So thank you all for coming. And
oh, I just said hi, friends.
sorry. And Eleanor says hi from the UK. Hi, everyone. Welcome. So I just want to say a few things before we get started. If you're new to Morbid Anatomy, welcome. My name is Joanna Evanstein, and with my colleagues Christina, who is silently in the background, and Megan Fitzpatrick, we run Morbid Anatomy, which is an organization that produces lectures like this, but also classes and books, and has an open to the public research library in New York. And if you want to know more, you can check us out at morbidanatomy.org online. And we have a couple free talks coming up I wanted to let you know about as well. On Monday, April 8th, we have Confessions of a Total Dickhead with David Gill, which is about his obsession with Philip K. Dick. That could be more clear in the title, probably. And then we have a talk on April 15th, which is called Blotter, the Untold Story of an Acid Medium with author Eric Davis. I hope you'll join us for those. And also, you might have noticed that we're recording. In fact, you probably had to hit a little button that said you acknowledge that. That's because 99% of the lectures we produce as part of our Monday night lecture series, we post to our Patreon. So if you're a member of our Patreon, for $5 a month, you have access to our entire backlog of videotaped lectures, which is about 270 now. I also want to let you know that if you have questions for the speaker, please share them or hold them until the end of the talk and then put them in the chat or the Q&A, and either myself or Christina will share them with the speaker. So I want to just let you know a little bit about tonight's presenter so you have a sense of where he's coming from. So Dan Morrison has reported on science, culture, and conflict for the New York Times, National Geographic, BBC News, The Guardian, and Art Forum. His 2010 book, The Black Nile, was praised by the Daily Beast as a masterful narrative of investigative reportage, travel writing, and contemporary history. His work has been recognized by the Association of British Science Writers, the New York Press Club, and the Society of Environmental Journalists. A former tabloid crime reporter, he serves as deputy world editor at USA Today while researching cholera, plague, and smallpox. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Morrison. Welcome, and thanks so much, everyone.
Hi there. So it's great to be here. Thank you. I'm going to tell you about some events that involved in the new book that I've got that just came out in the UK called The Prince and the Poisoner, and that was released a few months ago in the UK as The Poisoner of Bengal. And I think we should first start and consider where where the action is taking place, and that is Calcutta in the 1930s. It's the interwar period. It's jazz. It's the Jazz Age, and India had a Jazz Age, which might be surprising to some readers. And it's the second city of the British Empire, the vast British Empire. So Calcutta is a center of commerce, of culture, of politics. It's, you know, one of the most important ports in the world. It's the jewel in the crown as far as British India is concerned at that time. And just across the Hooghly River from Calcutta, if you want to consider, say, from Manhattan to Brooklyn, across the East River, there's a train station called the Howrah Terminus. It's the busiest train station in all of British India. And on a crowded Thursday, you've got a family arriving there, and they're waiting to take the train back home to their country patch. This is a clan of the rural nobility, creatures of feudalism, a kind of feudalism that essentially obtained across India and has at different times, you know, obtained across every rural patch of most of the world, in which you have a family at the top of a pyramid that controls the land, and they extract rents and, you know, tribute from the peasants who work the land, right? The peasants pay them for the privilege of working the land. They take a piece of that action, and then they pass that up the chain to whatever the higher power is. This clan, the Pandey clan, has been doing this since at least the 1600s, and they've been doing it here for at least the 1600s. Before the 1600s, they were in north central India, doing the same thing, living as feudal landholders and as rural nobility. A patch of famine sometime during the reign of the Mughal Emperor Akbar caused the family to trek east and take unclaimed lands at the lip of the empire, the lip of the Mughal Empire, and envelop them through force into that empire, where they became the rulers. So it's a patch of land. You think of it about the size of modern New York City, ruled by one clan from the late 1600s, well into the 20th century, and this is where they're headed home to. You've got a young man named Amarendra Chandra Pandey, who is just 20 years old. You've got his adopted mother. She's his aunt, but she's really his adopted mother, because his mother died at birth. Several sisters, some friends, and they're all making for a train that will take them home to Pakur after a sort of diverting 2 weeks in the big city. As a surprise, his elder brother appears at the station as well to see him off, and this is kind of unusual, because the brothers have been fighting. They've been fighting because they're the co-owners of an estate, but the elder brother has been in control of it. He's been raking off the money from the. He's been raking off the money. He's been using it, spending it on alcohol, on women, and on the movies. He's a party boy. This has been Amarendra Chandra Pandey. But uncharacteristically, there he is at the station to see off the rest of his family. He's in a very good mood. He's charming for once. He's disarming, and yet no one is entirely disarmed. And as the family make their way from their taxis into the station hall, and then onto the train platform, the younger brother gives out a shout, and he says, "I have been pricked." And 8 days later, he's dead. And that's the frame for this book. It becomes a case that is called the crime of the century in India. It sparks the longest criminal trial in the history of British India. It spawns conspiracy theories that continue to this day in some parts of Eastern India. And it eventually becomes the basis for a classic black and white social drama in India. So that's how we started. The Pakhr murder case happens in a sort of time of transition in British India, when no one actually believes or is aware that they're living in a time of transition. You have the freedom movement, the Gandhi-led freedom movement, has resurged after some years of dormancy. You have Jawaharlal Nehru, who's going to be the first prime minister of an independent India, serving sentence after sentence in jail and prison for the crime of sedition. You also have, and something that is much not as well known, that you have a violent underground conducting assassinations, monthly assassinations. There are gun plots, bomb plots. Radicals, they raid an armory in eastern Bengal. Bengal is at this time, the easternmost state of the unified British India. The main courthouse in Calcutta is an armed camp after a judge has his brains blown out on the bench by one of these radicals. So you've got the nonviolent resistance movement surging with hundreds of nonviolent detainees and nonviolent prisoners whipped in prison just for the sole purpose of breaking their spirit. On the other hand, you've got these bombings and hideouts. You have a surge in sympathy among the Indian middle class for these violent resistors, right? And then there's also something else happening where there are technological changes happening that are making entertainment and what we would think of as these kind of epochal technological changes available to Indians, and that's cars, it's movies, it's gramophones, right? Excuse me. Not everyone is out there getting beaten to death by the cops. Some people are really enjoying this period. There's a lot of music. The cabarets of Calcutta are full. You have jazz bands from the U.S., from South Africa, from the U.K. doing months-long or sometimes years-long stands at the private clubs and the Tony hotels of Calcutta. There's something else going on beyond sacrifice and struggle, and that's filtering its way into the upper middle class, certainly in the upper class and the upper middle class. And our villain, Banigendra Chandra Pandey, this is the Calcutta, this is the India that he likes. It's the India of racing cars and movies and drink and women. While the young man who's been pricked is sort of the archetype of a dutiful son of a relatively socially conservative aristocracy. So that's the setting that's the setting in which this happens. The role of cinema in this case and in that period was really telling to me. It was really caught my eye because movies had basically lit like this fire of desperation under both the British authorities and under Indian conservatives. The British authorities were concerned that as India had more and more movie halls, first British movies came in, of course, but these are swamped by American imports. Movies of Douglas Fairbanks, movies with Harold Lloyd, these silent films, right? Buster Keaton, and then the gangster films and the crime films of the early American cinema are sort of dominating the Indian movie scene, and the British are really appalled at this because these movies show white people, and in particular concern, white women, as normal lusty humans, which is just causes a lot of concern. you have ministers, you have leaders of civil organizations, all concerned about this. There's a commission that's formed to find out and seek out and prove how these American films are warping the morals of the Indian youth. At the same time, some Indian conservatives as well are concerned about their youth being turned lascivious by both British and American films. For a taste of how these movies were received, we'll turn to an autobiography that may be fictional of a well-born Calcutta prostitute. And she writes, "As meat is dangerous for the child who is only teething, so are novels, these theaters, and cinemas to young minds that are only budding." And of all these, cinema is by far the greatest corrupter, and it's also by far the biggest pursuit of our villain, Baniyendra Chandrapandi. And it's in cinema that I believe, and as I make the case in the book, that our villain has found his inspiration. Now, in India, as well as in other feudal societies around the world, there had been a long tradition of fratricide among the upper classes. That when the going got tough between siblings who were bound to inherit the same plot of land and its income and forced to share it, it was not considered unusual for one to die mysteriously or one to die but through overt violence. You can see this in certainly among the higher royalty, right? You can see that in any state any place that didn't have primogeniture as the law of the land. The heirs were bound to duke it out, right? In Ottoman Turkey, you have the eldest son slaughtering his brothers immediately at the moment of his father's death. You have it in Tang, China, where it was said that the heir apparent was born with one foot on the guillotine, right? And you have this in India in the battles of the various Mughal heirs against each other, and in the wars of the Rajput princes, all duking it out for the land. This filters down into the lower aristocracy as well, into these not quite petty landlords that control, patches the size of a county, patches the size of a state. There's a lot of money at stake, and in general, these people are not really raised to do anything other than collect rents and spend the money. So they're really desperate to keep their hands on the money. The great Indian memoirist Nirad Chowdhury describes these feuds among the gentry and within the families, as he compares them to the vendettas of the Corsicans, that these are undying feuds and undying enmity. The victim and the killer in our case, Baniyendra and Amarendra Chandrapandi, they're locked into a similar dynamic where you have an elder brother who wants it all and he wants it now, and the younger brother who's just trying to get by but has been raised in a culture of obedience and in a culture of diffidence, and so cannot truly fight back. He's still wed and a young man, entirely of his class, while the elder brother is a truly 20th century man. He wants to remake himself. It's the idea that you can become a new person, is one of the great ideas of America, certainly, and of the 20th century. And he wants to leave the country life behind, not leave its income behind, but leave the country life behind, and become a film producer. This is his great dream, and he sees his brothers standing in the way of that. So we have here a motive, and we have plenty of opportunity. What our killer needs is the means, and I believe he gets part of the means from a Sherlock Holmes story called The Adventure of the Dying Detective. In The Adventure of the Dying Detective, a young man, Victor Savage, has died of some terrible disease and has been sick for maybe 4 days before he passes away in agony. And Sherlock Holmes is investigating the death. To catch the killer, Sherlock Holmes feigns to himself fall sick by the same germ that has killed young Savage. The means of murder is a small decorative box that Victor Savage opens, and a coiled spring, coiled like a viper's tooth, the book says, springs out and jabs him in the thumb, and he's dead in 4 days. Holmes, who's investigating the case, receives a similar box. When John Watson finds him, Sherlock Holmes is lying on his deathbed, and I'll find you a picture from Collier's magazine showing poor Holmes on his deathbed. This book was this short story, which appeared in the Strand magazine and Collier's, and later made its way to India in the collection His Last Bow, was considered one of the was just a real treat for readers and for reviewers. Holmes feigns that he's dying, and then tricks the killer, who is Vincent Savage's uncle, into confessing. He thinks he's gloating over a dying Holmes, when in fact he's confessing. This book first appears in India in the early 20th century, and then returns in the 1920s as a silent film, and comes again in another form in 1932 as one of the first talkies to show in India, as in a film called The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And the similarities between the death of Victor Savage and the death of our boy Amarendra Pandey are too coincidental to be coincidence. In fact, and I'll stop there for a minute. Do we have any questions thus far that I can address before I go any farther?
So I don't have any in the chat right now. We usually ask people to hold until the end in case they get answered in the talk.
All right.
Keep going.
All right, I'll keep going. So, you're a wealthy, somewhat useless, rural aristocrat, and you want to bump off your brother. There are generally a couple ways you can do that. You can kill him in a hunting accident, and your mother, not wishing to bring shame on the family, will say it was an accident if asked by the police. You can have your private army, which many of these landowners had their own posses of gundas who did their dirty work. You can just have them beaten to death, and the newspaper clippings of early 20th century India are just packed with stories like this of warring brothers and warring first cousins going at it with armies of club wielding, sometimes hatchet wielding, sometimes spear wielding forces, and killing off their rivals after long simmering disputes. These aren't hayseeds. Some of these people they're judges, they're scholars, but the feud consumes them, and the feud reigns over all. Often this violence is preceded by long court cases in which one will ruin the other, and then which will make the losing party even more invested in the feud, but eventually it all comes down to violence, and and then arrest, right? So so there was a former judge, a former high court judge, who wrote in his memoir of his time as a judge in India the that the zamindar, that is to say the rural landowner, the zamindar was almost always the hidden hand behind rural violence, um, and that he was seldom brought to the dock. So if you take the judge's word that these men were seldom brought to the dock, and then you run that up against the number of cases that I've found in the archives of landowners um, being arrested and charged with murdering either family members or local rivals, it gives you a sense of the amount of sort of scheming and unreported violence that was going on then. Um, but our killer, Veniyendra Chandra Pandey, chose a different route, and that involved forming an alliance with a sort of down and out Calcutta surgeon who had trained in bacteriology at the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine, and looking for a more subtle means and a more modern means of homicide, and that's the germ murder. The germ murder is a mode of homicide that emerges in the very early 19th century, and it sort of coincides with advances in sort of the new fields of microbiology, the new theories of immunology, even up until the late 1800s. Most of medicine, and certainly most of public health medicine, sort of administrative medicine by the state, it was still basically leaning on almost on ancient thoughts on the origin of disease and the origin of epidemics and pandemics. That is to say, disease was caused by climate. Disease was caused by uneducated natives living among filth. That sort of thing. This is given sort of a florid expression during the third plague pandemic in late 1800s India, where plague arrives in Bombay in the 1890s and kills more than 10 million Indians. While this is happening, the British administration is trying to treat the disease by destroying the homes of the poor people who have acquired plague, and sending them off to camps where they can be clean. While a few foreign researchers who are there are trying to impress upon the British the notion of germs and germ theory and vaccination, it takes years and years for that to really sink into the administration. By the early 1900s, this is calming down because you have advances. You've got the creation of therapies for typhus, therapies for cholera, and other diseases, and there's a sort of a flourishing of investigation among both professionals and amateurs who are seeking to find out what makes disease tick and how to cure it. Okay, and what this means is that there's a lot of activity, there's a lot of research activity, and there are a lot of germs just sort of available to anyone who might want to order it from a lab. The controls and regulation haven't caught up with the advances in medical science and medical investigation, and so among the rich, almost exclusively among the rich in the United States and in Europe, you start to see cases of germ murder where people are bumping off their wives, they're bumping off their parents, they're bumping off their children, they're bumping off acquaintances for whom they have written out life insurance policies with a variety of germs. excuse me, including typhus, including cholera, including diphtheria. There's a case of a Polish count who kills his father-in-law with a shot of diphtheria germs. You have a number of cases out of Chicago, out of New York, involving typhus. You have a case in Austria where a germ called erysipelas is used by a medical student in an attempt to kill his girlfriend's parents after they forbid their marriage because he's not as wealthy as she is. And it's about this time that when the germ murder first gains strength, that in the notion of germ murder, that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, himself a physician, begins to write The Adventure of the Dying Detective. Now he does this earlier on. He does this in the late 19th century, but this is the milieu that they're in. And so Benny Chandra-Pandey and his down and out doctor friend, they go looking for microbes. And it's unclear, at least to me, although for others think it is clear, when they first start trying to kill Amarendra Pandey. There's an incident in 1932 where the two brothers are together at their aunt's country place for the holidays, for the spring holidays. And the two brothers go for a walk together, and the elder offers the younger brother a pair of pince-nez spectacles. And the younger brother tries them on and says that they're too small. And the elder brother says, well, that's nonsense. And he jams them onto the bridge of his nose so hard that he later recalls that it felt like a vein in my head had burst. The brother leaves that day and leaves that night. And then within a couple of days, Amarendra, the younger brother, starts to feel the facial twitches and a stiff neck, and then is finally both paralyzed but also trembling with the lockjaw and the seized up limbs of tetanus. A succession of doctors come through to try to cure him, and he is cured. But one of the doctors is his elder brother's friend, Taranath Bhattacharya. And there's this repeat conflict between the visiting doctors and the local doctor. First comes Taranath Bhattacharya, who is trying to fluff himself up as a big Calcutta doctor. And he tells him, no, you don't have to give him tetanus serum. You can only give him morphine. Morphine will do the trick, morphine alone. But morphine alone would, in reality, have left the boy in a stupor and killed him without the use of the tetanus serum. Other doctors with better earned reputations come through, and they make their own recommendations. And one is that after the boy appears to be cured, he should have one last shot of this serum injected deep into the muscle of his gluteals, and that this will kill out any remaining toxin that's in his body, although it will cause a return of the tetanus symptoms for a short time. And there's a lot of worry in the family over this advice. The big city doctor says to the local doctor, to the country doctor, you have more experience, but I have more knowledge. I've trained in the UK. I'm a member of the Royal Academy. And he wins the argument, and this last shot is driven into the boy, and this later becomes a deep infection requiring several surgeries to clean out. But he recovers, and the family considers that something of a miracle that he survived, and yet their nerves are on high. At some point, his surrogate mother forbids him to go out alone. He cannot go out alone at night without one of her servants alongside him as a retainer, because the suspicion of the brother is high, and yet they don't really address it beyond that. Now we come to the spring of 1933, when our victim, Amarendra Chandra Pandey, turns 18, or he's turned 18, excuse me, in 1932. And he's making legal moves to try to split the estate, or try to get some control of the estate that his brother controls and that his brother has been skimming off. And on the same day, two very different things happen in May 32. In Pakur, in the country patch, the younger brother files papers naming his own representatives to take part in the business of the estate. He wants to know what's going on, how much money is coming in, where does the money go. He has no insight into this. His brother views this as a betrayal. He mentions in their correspondence, something like this is, I will break bones over. But at the same time, on that same day in Calcutta, the down-and-out doctor Taranath Bhattacharya writes a letter to an institution called the Haffkine Institute in Bombay, which is the city's and the country's premier research institute for plague. It's named for Waldemar Haffkine, a Ukrainian Jew who invented not just the first vaccine for cholera, but the first vaccine for plague. He invented the first vaccine for cholera at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, tested the first batch on himself to prove its safety, and then was invited by the British to come and try to tackle cholera in India with mixed results. In the late 1800s, when plague breaks out in Bombay, the British administration first tries to downplay the outbreak of plague and deny the outbreak of plague, because it had been first identified by an Indian doctor, and even though he was an Indian doctor of high reputation, they just wouldn't believe it, because the implications of plague were too great for the business of Bombay, which was itself a major port. Once a British member of the Surgeon General's staff also identifies it as plague, they go calling for Haffkine to come and address the epidemic that again scythes its way across India, and certainly across Bombay and the surrounding state. And Waldemar Haffkine, then working at a feverish pace for 3 months, he has assistants. Some quit, some have nervous breakdowns. It's a breakneck pace, but he creates this vaccine. Once again, he has the quadruple the normal dose injected into himself to prove its safety, and then it begins to be distributed among the population, even though, again, many of the British authorities are still skeptical of this, because they prefer the theory of sanitation, which is that if you tear down enough native homes, then the plague will go away. So that's the Haffkine Institute. By now, in 1933, it's the only place in the country that's allowed to handle plague for research purposes. It's pumping out plague vaccine for use across the country, and it's sending samples of plague to research institutions as far away as South Africa and London. So Taranath writes a letter to them, and he says, I'm working on a cure for plague, and I require some samples. And the Haffkine Institute replies with tremendous skepticism, and eventually turns him down. He then realizes that if he can't get in the front door, then maybe a better known researcher can, and so he inveigles himself with a well-known Calcutta doctor, and the Calcutta doctor agrees to order some plague, so the young doctor can work on it on his therapy for plague. It's an interesting and sort of unanswered question about what happens to those plague germs, because they're sent across the country from Bombay to Calcutta, and the researcher in Calcutta receives a warning from Bombay. Take good care, these are extremely virulent germs. And yet they're unable to culture them. Or he says they're unable to culture them. The process of culturing is taking a small batch of germs and turning them into a bigger batch, right? And it doesn't take. And supposedly they try once, they try twice, and then they tell Taranath that it's just no good, and they destroy the samples with compressed steam. And it's always been a question to me, that one that isn't answered in the long trial record that I've gone through, or in any of the correspondence that I've found, whether that plague sample is actually dead on arrival, or whether the Calcutta researcher himself just lost his nerve, or just began to maybe saw Taranath as too eager, and just scotched the sample himself. But a year later, they try again, and this time Banarjendra Chandrapandi, who's described as, how is he described? He's described as every inch an aristocrat. This is a description from a young jailer who supervised him, who describes a large man with these sort of slow eyes and, thick limbs, and a confidence that some people are just born with a certain kind of confidence that they can get what they want and that they can do what they want. And even his adversaries would say, I never saw him angry. This wasn't a man of explosive temper. It was a man of sort of charm, determination, and great confidence. And so Banarjendra takes the 1.5-day long train trip across India to Calcutta, and he starts making impromptu visits to the homes of various doctors at the Haffkine Institute. It's not clear how he finds their addresses, or how he gets along with them, but there seems to be some police corruption involved in this. But the researcher after researcher describes opening their door to find a strange Bengali man who's offering them money if he can get them some plague germs out of the Haffkine Institute. And they all say no, they couldn't possibly. And yet none of them finds it imperative to mention this to the superiors, to mention it to the police. It's just a more diffident time and a more diffident society, and no one wanted to stick their neck out in ways that we would consider, probably natural today. There's a case of one researcher at the Haffkine Institute confides to a friend, this Bengali guy's been coming around looking for plague, and he says, yeah, he came to me too. It's pretty pervasive, but no one sends it up the chain of command. One of these researchers tells him that there's a hospital where they work with plague patients. It's the last hospital in the city that deals with plague patients, because the deaths have gone down from their sort of wildfire rates in the late 1800s, and now, as I believe the Lancet put it, only maybe 30,000 Indians a year were dying of plague, and that was considered like a tremendous reduction, like not reason for panic. So by now there's just one hospital in Bombay that deals with plague, and Banarjendra is sent to the head of that hospital, where he says he'd like some plague, and the doctor says, well, you can bring your guy over here and you can work in my lab, and maybe we can even test your friend's cure on some patients. Again, something that's sort of inconceivable today. So the hook is sort of baited here, but the way the deal is closed is that the doctor, the head of the hospital, receives an emergency call that a man is there's a taxi waiting downstairs. We've got a man in our hotel with suffering severe chest pain. You've got to come see him. He goes, he does that, and it's Banarjendra again, now complaining of chest pains. And what happens there is there's sort of a pantomime of a patient who says he has symptoms, but nothing objective can be seen, and a doctor who pretends to treat him. He's given light treatment where ultraviolet rays are shown onto his bare chest while he sits in dark glasses, and he pays the doctor a great sum of money. And then the laboratory is opened to the down and out Calcutta doctor, Taranath Bhattacharjee. I'm going to stop here for a second, and there are a few different ways I can go. I can tell you more about the murder. I can tell you more about the aftermath, or I can tell you about anything else. If you have a preference before our time winds down, let me know. I've been chatting for a while here. I've been talking for a while here.
Okay, if anyone would like to say in the chat or the Q&A what their preference is or any direction they'd like to see it go, please do. Let's give people a moment.
Mm-hmm.
The legal case, please, says Judy Jackson. Hi, Judy Jackson.
All right. So, the legal case. We go back to that scene at the train station where our victim feels a blow. Someone careens into him and spins away into the crowd, and the family says, "Who was it?" And basically what they ask him, they say, "Was it a gentleman?" And he says, "No, it was not a gentleman. It's a man, a dark-skinned man in a homespun outfit." The young man returns home, despite the sort of pleading of a cousin and of a close friend to stay in Calcutta and see a doctor. They are cowed by his elder brother, and the hierarchy of that society was such that though they all felt chilled to their bones by what had just been described to them, they could not contradict the elder brother to his face. And so they let their friend get on the train, and they return to their lives while their friend's life is ending. The ending is underway right at that very moment. He is dying, and they continue living. Some days later, he receives a letter from one of those friends begging him to return, and he does return to have his blood tested. And the first day he feels fine. He asks the doctor, can he return home? And the doctor says, just wait one night. And by the next day he has a fever, and within 3 days of his return to Calcutta, he's dead. He's dead, and is cremated within hours, which is the Hindu way, right? Just as in the Jewish religion and the Muslim religion, also you bury them quite quickly, and in among Hindus, when a person dies, they're generally cremated the same day. So there's no autopsy, there's no nothing. There's just this family's story of how he was pricked on the train. The family is bereft. You can only imagine the guilt they must have felt, for allowing him back on the train, for not protecting him, knowing that he was under threat. The surrogate mother and aunt is described as out of her mind. But that blood sample has been taken, and it's slowly being cultured. His blood had been drawn, injected into a vial of sort of a vegetable broth, and placed inside an incubator at the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine, where a young researcher whose uncle had treated Amarendra during his illness has directed him, do this and find what you can find. And he goes through this long and meticulous process of culturing these germs and then identifying them with many methods that are still in use today. That is, like scraping the germs across different gelatin mediums to see how they respond. And in the end, he's shocked to find the non-motile, gram-negative bipolar rods of plague. And almost every researcher at the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine comes through to view and identify, because while plague is still on the run, is still strong in India, Calcutta itself has not seen a case in 12 years. Eventually, their report stating that the boy died of plague makes its way back to the family and a family lawyer who is he's both engaged by the family to try to track down how the boy died, but he's more doing it out of his own personal grudge against Ben Oyender because Ben Oyender had earlier misled him into helping him raid a significant amount of money from a joint account that he'd held with the victim. And once this lawyer realizes that he's been played, he's very interested in getting to the bottom of it. This leads him. It's a story of tremendous. There are a lot of crazy coincidences that that surround this sort of mild-mannered country lawyer of a very high reputation, and one of them is that after he's shared with police the plague report and shared with them the story of the boy's feud with his elder brother and the events involving tetanus and various other events, he's called at the last minute to go to Bombay and take part in a case there. And as he gets on the train, he sees that his quarry, Ben Oyender, is a passenger in the next train compartment. And he runs out and calls the police. He says, "Hey, this is your murder suspect. He's on the train with me now heading to Bombay, where he got the plague. You've got to do something about it." And a few stops later, the railway police stop the train and they take Ben Oyender off, where they find him with a considerable amount of money, which is presumably for bribes, lists of all the enemies that he can think of, including his surrogate mother, who's raised him from the age of 4, and the secret police reports on the murder case, on the allegations that have been made against him, things he certainly shouldn't have and couldn't have without some really deep and intelligent acts of corruption. So Ben Oyender is pulled off the train and is, for the first time in his life, under the power of another man, which he's never experienced before, and eventually is taken back to Calcutta, where he and several other doctors are charged with murder. The lawyer continues to Bombay, does his legal work, and then does his own shoe leathering across the city, trying to find the hotel where Ben Oyender had stayed during his most recent visit, where, unbeknownst to anyone at that point, where he actually was able to inveigle the plague out of this hospital, the Arthur Road Hospital. He finds the hotel where Ben Oyender had been staying, and then he gets back to his own hotel, and the manager says, "I manage both those hotels. What were you looking for? What were you doing there?" And he says, "Well, I'm looking for this." He says, "Oh, I was his driver when he was here. He promised me. He said he was working on a plague cure, and he promised me the franchise, the exclusive franchise for Bombay. So I drove him around Bombay for a week for free because I knew I'd get this franchise." With this, he takes a statement from the hotel manager, listing all of Ben Oyender's stops at to see the various plague doctors, his time with the director of the Arthur Road Hospital, Taranath's time with the in the laboratory of that hospital, a visit to a local market where they bought white rats for testing. All of this comes out just based on the pure chance of this one lawyer staying in a certain hotel. He calls he sends a secret wire that night to the Calcutta Police Commissioner, and a detective inspector is dispatched from Calcutta to Bombay, and he returns with enough grit to hang at least 2 men and possibly 4. This leads to, again, what was called the trial of the century. You have the courthouse at Alipur, which again has been like an armed camp since the assassination of a judge on the bench, suddenly is flooded with spectators. The bailiffs can't hold them back. There's just intense interest there. The newspapers are going crazy. There are pamphlets. It's a jury trial with 6 professional men as the jurors, one of whom is a school teacher who has as his pupil a young boy named Satyajit Ray, who becomes, one of the greatest film directors of the 20th century. And Ray writes in his own memoir about how his teacher would come back every day from court, because court wasn't run on consecutive days all week. The court would be in session a couple days a week, and the rest of the time, the jurors would be back in their normal lives. And how the teacher would tell them every detail of the case, every in and out of the case, as they saw it during the long trial. The case is I've covered a lot of trials. I covered cops in courts as a reporter in New York in the 1990s, and so there are a lot of aspects of the case really stood out. One of the main ones being that neither the prosecution nor the defense nor the court itself used any independent experts to assess the evidence, the medical evidence and the scientific evidence. That is to say, there were witnesses. That is to say, lots of researchers from the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine, other researchers from the Haffkine Institute in Bombay, other doctors who had treated Amarendra at different times in his life. And they all had various levels of expertise, but they were all involved in the case. And some of them, because of, particularly in Calcutta, the clubby nature of the upper crust, all had been colleagues or students or teachers of one another, or they had treated different members of the family. Everything was very well enmeshed, and the Calcutta of the upper class was a bit of a small town. And so you have one of India's foremost experts on plague being asked about Amarendra's near fatal bout with tetanus, which he wasn't a party to, but he's being asked about this infection. The infection is being pinned on another doctor who had recommended that last serum injection, and the allegation is that he had introduced poison into the vial before the injection was given, and that's why the boy had that terrible infection that required the three surgeries to clean out. And so again and again, you have these researchers being asked about events that they really shouldn't have been commenting on, but it was a bit of a double-edged sword, because what these top scientists did was basically demolish the case that Amarendra's tetanus infection had been a case of some kind of poisoning, and they sort of take the knees out of the prosecution's case on that, and thereby help save the lives and at least in one case the reputations of 2 other doctors who've been charged in this murder conspiracy. This is also an interesting period where you have, for the first time, Indian researchers taking the reins of medical and scientific research in British India. So most medical research and most public medicine was the purview of something called the Indian Medical Service, which was formerly a branch of the British Indian Army. It was always run by a military officer, and researchers who worked there in supervisory capacities had attained military rank for doing it. Now, the Indian Medical Service, since the mid 1800s, had a colorblind admissions test, which is that if you passed the test, you could get in, right? And so it was open to Indians and Europeans alike. If you scored, you scored. But within that, the control of research basically stayed in European hands until this generation of doctors, where you see like a new generation coming up, and not just being out in the field taking care of patients or doing the sort of the lower level scut work of medical research, but you see them now directing it and directing institutions. So the deputy director of the Haffkine Institute, who was an Indian, Punjabi doctor, later becomes the first Indian to run the institute, and he reforms it utterly from top to bottom in a way that the British administrators had not for decades. Like it was known that there was sort of a creaky institution, but it took the elevation of this Indian doctor to be the first director before that reform takes place. That's just an aside, but so that's a strange thing. The defense is you have a very large defense bar there. Bennyendra has, I believe, 10 lawyers at his table. Taranath has 8. Another has 6, and I think one just has a couple. And he's the one who should never have been charged in the first place. But the police were extremely over eager, and it was a hot case, and they wanted to sweep as many people as they could. So the defense, it's a compelling defense, except for the fact that they were just absolutely guilty and did nothing to cover their tracks. The track covering, what they were waiting for, what they had based all this on, was that Amarendra would go home to Pakar. He would die in 4 days, just like Victor Savage did in The Adventure of the Dying Detective. And he would be cremated there in the backwater, on the banks of the Ganges in their rural backwater. And that would be the end of it. What they weren't counting on was that he would find the gumption, that he would activate himself and return to the city, and then that blood test would be drawn and would later bear fruit. So leaving that aside for a moment, well, if it had worked, he would just be dead and there would be no evidence, right? But he got the blood drawn. The defense had a ton of great points. Foremost is that no one had seen Amarendra collide with this mysterious man. He described it to members of the family. He described it to his own elder brother, who denied it, who denied that he'd ever had that conversation. It was pure hearsay. The pince nez fitting, also, this occurs between the two brothers when they're walking alone, in the evening through the woods, right? There's no other witness to this. Who is this mysterious man in homespun garb? I'll tell you who he is in the book, but as for purposes of the trial, he's unknown. He's a phantom, and the defense says this is a made up story made up by my enemies in the family, who I've been feuding with, who are trying to take things from me, and I'm trying to take things from them, and this is their way to destroy me. This is his first point. The second point is, how do you know it was plague that killed him? His body was cremated. He dies at 4 a.m. and his body's cremated by 8, right? You can't prove it was plague. The defense lawyers point out that when plague was discovered in the sample at the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine, they did multiple tests on multiple lab rats and gerbils and different animals to culture and reculture and reintroduce in different ways this pathogen to really be sure that it's plague. And then they did autopsies on each of these animals. And the defense said, how can you convict a man of murder and send him to the gallows with less investigation, with less medical investigation than you performed on a gerbil at the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine? It's just not right. They throw up a plethora of other germs that either appear similar to plague under the microscope or might have similar symptoms to plague. And these are shot down one by one. Again, not by the prosecution, but by the plague experts from the Haffkine Institute and from the Calcutta School of Tropical Medicine, who should, okay, you can say it's this one, but this one has never been seen in India. It only exists in China and Montana. One by one, they knock these alibi germs off. and in the end, they're not left with much. Benayendra has shown himself to be, um, he's been portrayed as a monster, and the defense with sort of nothing in its pocket um, doesn't put on a defense. They call no witnesses. The prosecution calls 80 witnesses. The defense calls none, and each of the defendants gives a long written statement to the court that is read by their lawyers, um, in which they declare their innocence, and in the case of Benayendra and Dr. Taranath, the vast conspiracy against them. Then comes, not only is it the longest criminal trial in the history of British India, you have the longest summation by a judge in the history of British India, where the judge Thomas Hobart Ellis gives a thoroughly long explanation of the case, where he seems to have his thumb on the scale at every opportunity for the prosecution. He mentions a dozen times in his summation the name of the mistress of the primary mistress of Benayendra, an actress and dancing girl named Balika Bala. She's not a witness in the case. She has no role in the case, but he keeps mentioning that he's got this chick on the side, which can only inflame the sensibilities of the 6 middle-class jurors. He mentions that Benayendra is suffering from syphilis, which he is, but again has not come up at trial. He had no role in the trial, but also could only inflame the jury against him. He mentions Benayendra and a man with the same description as the killer having drinks together, and he says, "Look, there's nothing wrong with a man having some drinks, but you've got to ask yourself why is he having a drink, 4.5 miles from his home when there are plenty of taverns nearby at his rented Calcutta house." The judge is thoroughly in the tank. The jury finds the men guilty. And they ask, can they please be spared? I'm sorry, the jury finds Benayendra and Taranath guilty. They acquit the other 2 doctors. And they ask, can Benayendra and Taranath, can they please be spared the death penalty? And the judge says absolutely not. He sentences them to hang. They are returned to Alipur jail, moved to quarters closer to the gallows, and then they wait in a sort of limbo where appeals to the Calcutta High Court are supposed to be heard with speed, particularly in capital cases, and theirs is not, and they just sort of roast and wait through the summer, kind of losing their minds until their appeal is finally taken up late that fall. For strange administrative reasons, it just sort of sat, during which time it's said that particularly Taranath, who was always a flighty sort, it just kind of went insane. Their appeal is taken up by a 2-man bench. By one is Jonathan Lort Williams, a former Tory member of Parliament from London, son of a wealthy solicitor. The other is Justice Nasim Ali, the son of a Calcutta Maulvi, who becomes the future Chief Justice of the Calcutta High Court, and then his son becomes Chief Justice of the Calcutta High Court later. These 2 men hear the appeal, and they write this extraordinary decision where they point out all the deficiencies in the prosecution's case. They point out the rank bias of the trial judge. And they say, it was thoroughly biased. And then they find on their own, the 2 men guilty all over again. When their decision at the beginning hits every point of Benayendra's appeal, it's like a chime, ding, 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 ding. And then, and you can just imagine these men reading the decision, and the flutter of the heart as they as they think it might be working, and then basically they say, but there's really no doubt that these guys are guilty. We're even more qualified than the jury to determine these facts, and they're guilty as sin. Um, because of the excruciating delay in hearing the appeal, they rescind the death penalty. They're sentenced to life in prison for murder. And this would normally mean that both men would be shipped off to the Andaman Islands, where it's sort of almost a prison colony on a small island chain in the southern Bay of Bengal. Um, and that doesn't happen either. Somehow, by some administrative snag or kismet, both men spend their sentences in Bengal. They're not forced into exile across the Black Waters, and there they stay until August 1947, when India gains its independence, and Jawaharlal Nehru, who had been an inmate in the Alipur jail in the early days of the trial, when both Banayendra and Taranath were there. Their fellow inmate, becomes the first, prime minister of independent India, and they are released in an amnesty that was the amnesty was supposed to be for political prisoners, but they've been let out as well. And the story takes one last turn that I won't tell you about. You'll have to read it. All right, back to you, Joanna.
Hi, Dan. Thank you. That was fascinating. And it's Christina here. Hello.
Hey.
If anybody has any questions, do drop them in the chat and we will relay them to Dan. Wow, what a whirlwind. And especially now having gone through a pandemic, like what sort of parallels did you see having researched this past intrigue with our current climate and how we handled COVID, or how COVID was handled around the world?
Well, during the third plague pandemic, which ravaged India, you had anti-vax riots. There's this intense and tremendous mistrust between the people of India and their colonial rulers, right, in the vast gulfs of just culture and education and experience. And the as we know now, plague is spread generally by the rat flea, which the rat flea is itself infected. It kills its host, which is the rat, and then the fleas jump to the next, the most proximate victim, which is humans and generally the poor, right? So the housing stock of India, the mud and wattle homes, this sort of thing, were more accommodating to rats than the big brick houses that the British were living in. But what it showed to many Indians was that the British just aren't dying, and we're dying, right? And this set off a lot of conspiratorial talk that the plague was introduced by the British to put down a restive population. The plague hospitals, which were set up after the outbreak in Calcutta, in Bombay, they created a system of mandatory hospitalization, and this created intense dread among the populace for reasons of caste and religion and propriety, and whose food will who be eating in the hospitals, right? Like a Brahmin can't eat food prepared by a lesser caste, right? It's impure, right? And this sort of multiplied throughout many communities. The search for bubonic plague produces something called a bubo, which is like this sort of like dark, painful, froggy protrusion from the lymph glands, right? That's under your arms and that's at your groin. And so health authorities were searching men and women like at train stations, right? And that this caused, intense consternation that women might be fondled by these foreign doctors. They brought in women, European female doctors. They called them lady doctors. Lady doctors will do the examination. But even then, it was just too much. The homes were, you had random home inspections, soldiers coming into homes looking for sick people. Um, and then eventually in a city south of Bombay called Pune, the plague commissioner there named Charles Rand was eventually assassinated. He and another Englishman were leaving I believe, a party celebrating the birthday of Queen Victoria when they were gunned down on the road. That's how high the passions were. So when Waldemar Haffkine develops his vaccine, there's sort of a split screen response where some badly hit communities were clamoring for the vaccine, but others just very much distrusted this idea of injection. What is in it? Are there animal products in it? What is inside? It's more, impurity and imposition by this, supernal foreign power, essentially. So there are vaccine riots when plague comes to Calcutta. A big chunk of the population flees. They're not fleeing plague; they're fleeing the plague remediation measures that they saw Bombay undergo, and the government vaccinator teams basically go out taking their lives in their hands because there are mobs of people trying to kill vaccinators because they just see them as murderers. And this is bolstered by the fact that no one is cured of plague. No one is cured in these hospitals because at this stage they don't know what causes plague. And so either you survive or you don't. And so the fact that so many are going in and so few are coming out just is absolute proof to most people that the British are up to something shady. You have like a layer of scam artists who are pretending to be plague inspectors so they can get bribes out of you to not drag you to the hospital when they never had the power to drag you in the hospital in the first place. This all just revs up the populace to the point that the Arthur Road Hospital, which was later where Bannerjendra and Taranath got the plague germs to kill Amarendra, the first incarnation of the Arthur Road Hospital is attacked and stoned by mill hands who just believe that people are being killed there. They can hear the groans of the people dying. These are thatched roofed wards, hastily put up in the emergency, and they can hear the dying, from the street. There's one thing that's different about plague in India as opposed to plague in some other places during this pandemic, and that is that the British, sort of in a general way, blamed the unclean Indians and the unhealthy Indian climate for plague, but there was no sort of like specific blame for the pandemic put on any particular minority group or sector of society. Whereas, when plague hits Australia, San Francisco, Honolulu, it's like Chinese. It's like it's the filthy Chinese that are blamed for plague. When it reaches Cape Town, it's what do they call them? Raw Africans and filthy Jews were the source of plague in Cape Town. When plague hits Glasgow, it's Irish Catholics who are blamed for plague in Glasgow. But the difference is that all these cities and places suffered very small outbreaks that killed people in the tens or maybe the hundreds, while in India it was just a wildfire across the country. And in this you have skeptics and you have opportunists looking to create cheaper or more persuasive cures. And in one case, one of the great fake patent cures for plague was iodine, and the idea was that injections of iodine would sanitize the blood and kill the pathogens and save you. there's one professor from Bombay University, a chemistry professor, who believed that who testified at a fact-finding inquiry, his belief that the vaccine was not dead but dormant, that the plague was dormant but not dead in the vaccine, and then while making the vaccinated people with giving them greater immunity to plague, also helped them spread it to others. And he had, look, the places with the most vaccinations are the places with the most deaths. But the reason why the places with the most vaccinations had the most deaths was because they were so desperate to get it that they, the level of death moved those authorities into taking the vaccine. But this false cure of iodine sort of persists across the decades, to the point that Taranath Bhattacharjee, in his defense, says he's working on an iodine cure, where he's going to combine his dream, as he states it in his statement in court, was to combine sort of Western medicine with Indian Ayurvedic medicine. And so his cure was a combination of iodine and neem, which is sort of a medicinal leaf in India used for a lot of applications. And they even cite at trial, no, doctors are still using iodine for plague, but which was true. But when you look down into the writings of doctors at that time, the reason they're giving their patients iodine for plague is just for placebo reasons. Is that a doctor has to do something, and so they were giving their patients giving their patients iodine, knowing full well that at this point decades of research showed that iodine was completely ineffective against plague. Iodine and a raft of other antiseptics were all proven to be useless against plague. So I'll tell you one more thing. Aspect is that the professor in Bombay who's selling that patent cure and testifying that vaccines cause or that the vaccines are causing plague to spread. The reason he's prominent, the reason that anyone listens to him, or that the reason that he has the audience he has, is that he became sort of a national hero among the Indian upper class by restoring a statue of Queen Victoria that nationalists had doused with tar. So in South Bombay, there was this very large, haughty white marble statue of Victoria that was defaced, and then they had to cover it up with plywood so that the natives would not see the queen defaced. And no one could figure out a way how to restore this statue. But this Punjabi chemistry professor, he was able to do it where none of the European or Western experts could. And so it became a point of pride among the upper class that it was an Indian who could restore to its pristine condition this statue of Queen Victoria. And that gives him the platform for his patent fake iodine medicine and for his skepticism of vaccines. Turns out that the person who doused that statue with tar was one of the two brothers who later assassinated the plague commissioner Charles Rand in Pune during the plague epidemic. It's just this sort of strange circular thing involving plague and the personalities around it. I can't remember what the question was, and I've been talking a long time. What else would you like to know?
That was fascinating. We actually have an attendee here, our friend Judy Jackson, who is a forensic psychologist, if I remember correctly.
That's great.
And said, I've